Okay, so welcome to those who have just come on board with the webinar, because I understand it's just been started, so we'll just give it a couple more moments to let some more people in before we get started. Okay, I think we will kick things off there without further ado. So welcome to today's webinar, the RTPI President's visit to Nene Park, or at least virtual visit. So I'm pleased to be joined today by the speakers Andrew Mcdermott and Matthew Bradbury from the Nene Park Trust. First things first, my name is Ian Long, Senior Land and Planning Consultant at Boyer Planning and Chair of the East Midlands Young Planners, and I will also be Chair of the webinar today. I will just run through a couple of housekeeping points with you first, just to go through these before the session starts, before I introduce the speakers. So as attendees, you will have been muted by the organisers today, so if you have any questions, then please feel free to pop these into the question box, which comes up on the sidebar. Should be in the right or top of your screen. So if you have any questions, please feel free to extend those to the speakers in there. The speaker presentations will run for about 45 minutes today, after which we'll have a question and answer. So feel free to raise any questions that you might have, and we'll cover those off at the end of the session. If you personally lose connection to the session, then please try rejoining via the link which was emailed to you from GoToWebinar. Just do that if you lose connection. If the speakers themselves lose connectivity, then please wait in the webinar, and there may be an email that comes around in case you have to relaunch the session, but hopefully that won't happen. Copies of the presentations will be circulated as a PDF, and a link of the presentation will be available on the RTPI's website after the session. So if I could just introduce today's speakers before they get started. So we're joined first and foremost by Matthew Bradbury, who's the CEO of the Nene Park Trust. During his time with the Nene Park Trust, Matthew has remaster planned the park's extensive land holding and implemented a 10-year strategy titled Doing More with More. Matthew's passionate about the environment and the benefit it provides. Previously, he held senior roles at the Land Trust and Norfolk Wildlife Trust. He takes an active role with the Parks Alliance, is a board member of Cambridgeshire Local Nature Partnership, and a member of the Broads Authority and trustee of Living Sports. Joining Matthew today is Andrew Mcdermott, who's the head of development at the Nene Park Trust. And Andrew leads on new projects in the trust, from community development to new business and infrastructure projects. His background is in countryside and environmental management with a specialism in forestry. Andrew has previously worked in various project management roles across the not-for-profit, charity and commercial sectors, as well as having practical land management experience. So we are also joined today, as is the President's visit, by the RTPI President, Dr. Wei Yang. And Wei Yang is the President of the RTPI for 2021. She is a lead figure in researching, promoting and the implementation of 21st century garden city approaches worldwide. Wei is the founder of Wei Yang and Partners, an award-winning master planning firm in London, actively promoting joined-up thinking between different professionals. Wei is a fellow of Academy of Social Sciences, an independent trustee of the Landscape Institute, and a board member of the British Library, as well as a board trustee at Milton Keynes City Discovery Centre. Let's go back to my notes. So without further ado, I would like to now pass over to the speakers, Matthew and Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I think it's down to me to kick off, although I have to say it's Andrew that's the main act today, not me. I don't have a presentation as such, but it does fall to me to welcome you all to Nene Park Trust, albeit virtually. We hope we'll see you in person sooner rather than later. And it's not often that we welcome a president to Nene Park, so welcome to Nene Park. It's a pleasure to have you with us on your visit today, and a pleasure to talk about something that both Andrew and I are incredibly passionate about, and I'm sure you'll pick that up fairly quickly. Also, a pleasure to be amongst fellow Landscape Institute members as well. So I'm a member Wei, and just joined the council at Landscape Institute, so I'm looking forward to seeing you there too. We're one of two of the larger parks trusts in the UK. There are a number, and some are I think are much smaller than us. The other very large one, and created really in our image, and actually larger now, is the Milton Keynes Parks Trust, and both organisations were created by development corporations. So we were conceived by Peterborough Development Corporation. I'm not going to go into those details because I guess Andrew might want to cover that in a little bit more detail. But we're relatively I was going to say we're relatively unique. That doesn't make any sense at all. We are unique, but we share our uniqueness with Milton Keynes Parks Trust, in that there aren't any other parks trusts in the country that yet stand on their own 2 feet. Although I think Urban Green in Newcastle are on the way. They're much younger than we are. That said, we're also incredibly young ourselves. We're a young organisation. We're still really getting used to managing land. We have we always joke that we have a 999-year tenancy on Nene Park land, and that we're only 30 odd years into that, and we don't want things to go wrong on our watch, given that we need to be handing it on in the future. But I think it's also worth just reflecting a little before I hand over to Andrew on what kind of organisation we are. And I think when the park was conceived in the 1970s, when the charity took over in the 1980s, the focus was very much on maintaining what essentially was a very large new park. And the focus, I think, for the first 20 years was really on maintenance and management. So cutting grass, sorting out the trees, getting the landscape right, maintaining the infrastructure. And I think it's really only in the last 10 to 15 years that we've started to understand what our impact could be, both as a park and as a charity, and our focus has changed hugely. Andrew will talk about that in a bit more detail, but I think it's fair to say that we've turned from being an inward-looking organisation that was focused on management and maintenance to an outwardly focused organisation which does management and maintenance, but does it because actually we're trying to maintain the platform on which we're delivering nature, activity, culture, community and socially focused programs. And I think we've also shifted from an organisation that didn't put its head above the parapet to an organisation now that is certainly trying to, and I think is punching well above its weight. We remain relatively small. There's about 60 or 70 of us, depending on what time of year it is, and but we do things like lead the Future Parks Accelerator program for Cambridgeshire, which is one of 6 programs within the Future Parks Accelerator family, and that's funded by National Trust, Heritage Fund and MHCLG. It's an accelerator program looking at parks across the country and how parks can become more sustainable, how the benefits of green space can be realised on behalf of communities, and what kind of models parks can be managed under and developed under. We're also operating, of course, within that in the fastest growing county in the UK, and there's a lot of pressure coming on existing public open space and a lot of plans to develop new public open space, and how do you link those things together? How does that work from a planning point of view? How do we understand how the new planning bill, the new environment bill, the development of biodiversity net gain, how does that all play into parks and green space, as well as into nature, biodiversity, the climate emergency, social change, and social justice as well? So we're looking at all of those things through that Future Parks Accelerator lens, and a lot of the outputs from that will be published in due course. We've got another 9 months, 10 months to run on that project. We're also leading the development of the culture strategy for Peterborough. Peterborough being a unitary, so it's bigger than the city. So we're developing a new strategy which we hope will lead to a joint bid with the county for a County of Culture programme in the future. We're a long way from that, but certainly leading a lot of that. And we also hold some of the cultural assets on behalf of the city. We run Arts Council related programs as well. So, you know, we've broadened out quite a lot just from that focus on parks. I chair the Towns Fund Board for Peterborough, so we're also involved in investment. Andrew leads on one of the major projects in the Towns Fund portfolio. So again, you know, trying to demonstrate that leadership. And as Ian mentioned in the introduction, we're also intimately involved in the development, management and growth of Natural Cambridgeshire, which is the local nature partnership. So a real focus on biodiversity, a real focus on people, all within that framework of a really fast growing county and region. I lead on the Landscape Institute's Parks and Green Spaces Forum and are developing Parks and Green Spaces strategy, and that's really come from my involvement with Parks Alliance and leading the Parks Alliance, and so we're kind of helping to develop, we hope, national policy, and previously been involved in the Parks Action Group and the Select Committee inquiry for green space. So again, you know, trying to play that kind of policy leadership role with a really straight bat, I have to say. You know, it's not everybody that wants to engage with the Parks Trust, because we're looked upon by some local authority parks departments with some nervousness, I think, in that you know, there is nervousness about promoting our kind of model within local authorities, because there is this sense that by, you know, through changing the way that parks and public open spaces are managed, that jobs may be at risk, or that some of the impact of those public open spaces may indeed be at risk itself. So we have links with many bodies, we lead many local organisations, we lead many projects. We're involved in landscape scale projects across the region now, and we're also now developing sustainable farming partnerships and food production. We're into sports and activity in a big way. But all of that leads us to be really at capacity constantly. As a small organisation, we're suffering growing pains most of the time of one sort or another, which is not perhaps surprising given what we're doing. And of course, this issue of being in one of the fastest growing cities in the country. We're now 37 minutes from King's Cross on the train, so you can get to Peterborough more quickly than you can get to the outskirts of London. So you know, that brings with it all sorts of challenges as well. And I haven't mentioned the pandemic, but the pandemic has also brought with it a lot of challenges in terms of the way we operate, the way we run the park, but also I think has challenged us with, you know, hugely increasing amounts of litter, accompanied by other problems associated, again, with the capacity of the park itself. And I'm going to stop there and hand over to Andrew, who I'm sure will perhaps repeat some of the things I've just said, but probably in a more coherent way.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, no, that's a good introduction, and I will just try and share my screen. Hopefully it will come up without too much of a challenge. So hopefully that can be seen now. Do shout if there's any issues. Thanks, Matthew, for that introduction. Thanks, Ian. You know, Matthew mentioned a huge variety of the things that we do there, and I could probably talk on any one of those for an hour or two at a time. So I've got a lot that I'll try and sort of canter through, and hopefully mention a variety of things which might lead to some questions at the end if there's any particular areas of interest that people would like to touch on. But I'll cover the sort of creation of Nene Park. I'm sure from a planning perspective, I probably don't need to go into too many details, as I imagine you're well versed. But I'll cover that a bit and talk about the setting. I'll touch on the master plan that's been referred to briefly and some of our key projects. And all the time, try and reflect on this balancing act that Matthew sort of referred to as well, where we balance nature conservation and recreation, charitable and commercial work, trying to be accessible, but also being a natural and sort of wild space in some ways, and also, you know, similarly being a peaceful space, but actually being reachable by the population. And there's sort of all this tension and balance in that we're constantly working on, and is a feature in all of our work. So to kick off, as has been mentioned, we're a new town. You can see, as I'm sure you'll be aware, the New Towns Act and Peterborough was one formed from 1965 Act, I believe, and has seen sort of significant growth. It's a historic city. If you don't know Peterborough very well, hopefully, given with the Midlands Group, people are aware of it. But it's a cathedral. It's, you know, it's a cathedral city. It's not an entirely sort of new build or an amassment of smaller settlements. So it really is building on a heritage core, but has changed massively from then. And a lot of that, as Matthew has said, is down to the Development Corporation, but particularly the general manager at the time, Wyndham Thomas, who was a great admirer of Ebenezer Howard, and in coming to Peterborough and visiting the land around it, really identified this sort of very, very open, and I think at one time he did refer to it as a bit of a bleak landscape. I'm sure some people who love the Fens would not describe it as a bleak landscape, but certainly keen to plant trees to make a park, and the intention of having this green public space was really an early element of the plans for the new town of Peterborough, rather than any sort of restoration scheme. It really was in the works from the very beginning, and this draft plan sort of illustrates that. So that the initial plan prepared by a team led by Tom Hancock looked at how there's this sort of natural corridor, and that this is, you know, related to the availability of green space, the likelihood of flooding as well. So there's a bit of natural capital thinking coming in even sort of early on there about how best to use the space in the city. I'll just put that plan up a little bit bigger, because if you're anything like me, you like a good plan, and it's very interesting to reflect, for those who know Peterborough, on some of these original plans for how the city might grow. But you can see there, centrally in the middle of the picture, Country Park being clearly identified, and in the Peterborough Master Plan, right at the beginning, this sort of green ribbon that flowed right through the city was a really important feature. So from the establishment of the new town, and certainly from 1970 onwards, the population grew massively, and we're still seeing that huge growth now as the city creeps over 200,000. So the design of the park was really focused around the extraction of gravel, which was used in a lot of the construction of the city, particularly the roads and the parkways. There was a contract let for the extraction of that gravel, which actually enforced the closure of some other gravel pits temporarily in different parts of the country, so that the park would be complete, the gravel extraction would be complete within the time window that the Development Corporation wanted the space to be ready and active for the local community. So it really was obviously an important feature of their master plan, their design, and certainly not an afterthought. And they involved a whole range of organisations, both in the design of the park and, as I'll come on to mention, in the governance of it going forward. So a few, just these are always good to sort of give a flavour of what the landscape was like, but this is one of the main views, main access into the park, and I'll show you a picture of what it looks like now in a second. But this is obviously the gravel extraction that was ongoing, and the sort of huge impact on the landscape. And now when we look down this route, this is one of the main access points into the park. The most notable feature is clearly the vegetation growth, but I think it's hard for many people to imagine what was there before. And again, this is a view that looks over to where our visitor centre now sits, sort of in the right-hand side of this picture, and you can see how intensive the activity was. I'll come on to mention a bit about the heritage, but it's worth noting whilst looking at these pictures that the majority of the area in front of us here is a scheduled ancient monument of potentially international importance. And we now tread very carefully around that, and you can see at the time there was a lot of activity going on upon it. And again, that's the view. This is a slightly old photo, but that's the view of the area broadly now. Sadly, the large trees you see in the main of the photo have had to come down. They're all elm trees, and for a long time we were looking after them very closely to protect them from Dutch elm disease. But unfortunately, last year one was very badly struck, and then that passed to the others. So we unfortunately felled those, though we have replaced them with hybrid elms that are supposed to have resistance to Dutch elm. But you can see that the real significant change in the landscape there, and the creation of a park from the remains of that gravel extraction. So just to sort of set the wider scene, this is looking from the centre of Peterborough out towards the A1. So the A1 would be at the sort of very distant end of the picture. And you can see how this sort of green ribbon works. There's some gaps in it. The big gap near the top is owned by an adjacent private landowner, Milton Estates. And as you go into the city centre at the bottom, there's areas of land which are owned by the city council and for some reason weren't included within the lease. You know, it's the vagaries of a red line plan at some point, although we're now in discussions and have been for a number of years about how we can work with the council to manage some of that green space. So the park itself, although it was in use whilst gravel works, many people who live locally have memories of swimming in the lakes while it was still a gravel works. It was formally established in 1978. And currently today is just over a little bit over 700 hectares, and we have around 2 million visits a year, predominantly to Ferry Meadows, which is that sort of horseshoe of lakes, but increasingly across the park. So the charity of the trust was established in 1988. So as Matthew says, you know, in the grand schemes of sort of land management charities, you know, we are a youngster compared to many of our colleagues, such as organisations like the National Trust, for instance. And that was an asset transfer and a long lease from the Peterborough Development Corporation. So we currently have around 70 staff, as Matthew said, depending on what time of year it is. I suppose we have something like 50 core staff probably all year round, and the organisation turns over about 3 million. But we have a whole range of tenants and operators that work within the parks, and the sort of net, the gross turnover of all those organisations would be quite significant, and the gross employment quite significant as well. And our income comes from a range of sources, but we have a mixed investment portfolio. So there's a small investment endowment alongside some commercial property, and over the years that commercial property has changed a little bit. Some of it's retained, some of it was sold. We have grown our investments, but we've also grown our income from things such as car parking income and the way we run activities and events. But the model is entirely independent of government funding, so we don't have sort of any subsidy. We're not formally engaged with the council in any way, and that's been a really significant thing for us to communicate over the last few years as we've turned our attention to sort of growing our income and managing the demands on the park, is helping people understand that the park is run by a trust, which is a charity, and is not run by the local government, which is a common misconception. So here's a plan on the right orientation for those that prefer it that way, just showing the extent of our main red line. Although there are a couple of other areas that have crept into this recently, which are off plan. So we've recently taken on responsibility for opening Longthorpe Tower, which is a historic England building, which is just the top right of this plan. And we've also recently taken a long lease that matches up with the rest of our lease on an area of City Council land called Tenter Hill, which was earmarked at one point for housing development, but was resisted by local residents and has now been put in trust to us to manage with their support. So a little bit more about the trust, just briefly. So our charitable objective, whilst mentioning parks, is very broad and is really about improving quality of life for the people of Peterborough and visitors. And you know, that's something that, as Matthew's mentioned, over the last 10 years, the last 5 particularly, but so over the last 10 years, we've really tried to look more outside the park and look at the impact that we can make and what we're doing for people, rather than just considering how we maintain the park and mow the grass. And so we're a registered charity. We've got a trading subsidiary that runs some of our things, such as the visitor centre. And with the collapse of Vivacity, which was the city's sort of culture and leisure charity, we absorbed a few of their we absorbed the charity of Vivacity, actually, although it's before that its services and its assets were sort of shared out to the council and us and some others, but we absorbed that charity and subsequently have taken on board the Peterborough Sculpture Collection. the trust managed by a board of trustees, so that there's an interesting history to that, and I can talk about it at length, but previously all the trustees were nominated by different bodies, so the Department of Land Use and Economy at University of Cambridge, Peterborough City Council, RICS, RTPI, lots of different institutes and bodies, the Bishop of Peterborough. So there's a variety of people that nominated trustees to join the board. Over the last few years, we've reviewed that governance quite substantially. And although the City Council still nominate a couple of trustees, the rest are appointed in a more modern fashion, and we base that on the skills and requirements of what the board needs, and also with an effort to try and increase the diversity of our board, which is an issue for us as it is an increasing issue for many charities. We represent an incredibly diverse population in Peterborough and in the work we do, and we serve them, but we don't represent that in our board of trustees, and we don't currently represent that with our staff, so that's something we're conscious of as well. And that new governance mechanism is really focused on trying to integrate the community with our governance as much as their everyday enjoyment in the park as well. And as I mentioned earlier, there's an entirely independent model, both in governance and in our finances. So a bit about the setting. One thing that's interesting about Peterborough, it is a confluence of cultures. So it's got a really deep history with Boudicca and the Roman Empire, with designed Georgian landscape, with the new town, and with more recent modern migration into the city, and the huge number of languages which is often reported on that are spoken within Peterborough. So it really is a changing landscape, influenced by all those cultures that have found a home and come through it, and that's been influenced by the river as a means for transport. It's been influenced by the quality of the land and its geography and the landscape. So I could have done several slides on each of these areas, but just to give you a flavour of what we're dealing with, there's a huge amount of sort of natural and built heritage. We've got 7 scheduled ancient monuments across the site. We've got a site of special scientific interest as part of the site. We've got various listed structures. So the image at the bottom left is Milton Frere Bridge. It's actually owned by the City Council, but is within our land and crosses over the River Nene. We've got ancient and semi-natural woodland. We've got a plethora of protected species, including bats and otters, and that's not the Loch Ness Monster appearing at the top left, but a snap of one of our photogenic otters that was that were incredibly flirtatious during the floods last year, and we have visitors being able to regularly observe otters swimming around the park quite happily. And some of our projects have led to real significant increases in biodiversity, most notably around wading birds. So there's a glossy ibis in the right bottom picture, which is quite a rare spot for the park, but we've had a whole host of really interesting bird spots in the park, bird records in the park over the last couple of years. And historically, the network of lakes, rivers, grassland, woodland has been of interest and created great biodiversity interest, although in some areas that's improved over the lifetime of the trust, and in others that's decreased as areas of encroachment and scrub regeneration have dominated some types of habitat. And of course, water's featured pretty heavily in a lot of the pictures I've shown you, and not only is the park a natural floodplain, but it's also a designed floodplain in terms of its protection for the city and its ability to hold water. The Nene, where we are, is very heavily controlled, so there's a number of locks and sluices and staunches and whatever else you might call them in the local area, which really do have an impact on the water in the park. So we often can find ourselves underwater, and managing that is part of managing the park. So alongside all of that is increasingly, and Matthew mentioned it again, and I mentioned at the beginning, about this balancing act of leisure and recreation, and this is incredibly important to the trust. It's why we're here. We're here for the people first and foremost. So not only is green space important to the Garden City movement, but over the last year, particularly through the pandemic, we've seen how important green space is to communities, and we've seen a huge increase in use over the last year. Maybe because no one had anywhere else to go, or maybe because people have really valued having open spaces and natural environment to be in when they've been in really difficult times. So over the years, we've developed a real range of sporting and leisure uses. We've got play areas, so the bottom right is a real old picture. You won't find a landscape that looks much like that in Nene Park anymore, but before the trees and the vegetation took hold, we really did have a beach and some very old school play, which you probably wouldn't get past many play inspectors today. But conversely, we are still taking a risk to how we design play, and on the left is an example of some of the pop-up play that we created a number of years ago when we were experimenting with a new natural play approach. We also have, in addition to the play areas, one of our most popular things and a really important feature for people in the park is barbecuing and eating in the park and coming as groups and coming as family to eat, and that's particularly important with our more diverse families and communities that are visiting the park, and it's often a really key feature of why people are coming to use the park. And on a nice summer's evening, you can walk around the park and the smells are really quite fantastic. Alongside that, we've got education, formal sports pitches, golf courses. There's a miniature railway, the rowing course you can see in the top left picture there. So this is looking back in towards the centre of Peterborough. And the whole time we're managing this alongside trying to improve and grow our biodiversity. And I could have easily switched all these pictures quite quickly and shown you the mess that can be left after this as well, which is, as Matthew mentioned, a real challenge for us. And I think the majority of our visitors are very supportive of us in trying to manage that challenge, but it remains one. But one of the key things really, and I mentioned it there, we're here for the people, and this slide is just to really try and exemplify, that is the community health and well-being that really is a big focus for us, and is what we try and focus our work on. And there's links to that, from a financial side of things as well. Actually, there's much of our work that is increasingly being recognised for its benefits for health and well-being, and the scale of money spent on parks and green space compared with other areas of our sort of national spending is minute. So even a very small amount of money from something like the NHS coming into social prescribing in green space can make a huge difference, directly impacting communities, but also on biodiversity. So it's worth sort of mentioning that briefly. So with all those things taken into consideration, a few years ago, so 2014, 2015, with increasing pressures on the park, we considered the future of the park and where we were heading, having established well, but feeling increasing pressures, and also operating with an increasing deficit over a number of years. As much of the park infrastructure, whilst being a young organisation, much of the infrastructure is of an identical age, which means that it's aging at the same time, and a lot of it's getting to the end of its life within the same time window, 30, 40 years. We're seeing huge need for replacements and increased maintenance across the estate, which is a real challenge. At the same time as the population grows, the new town phase, much of that was completed in the 60s and 70s, but we still have Hampton, which I'm sure you're aware of, and other areas of the city where a significant house building goes on, and the region generally as well, as the park really is a regional attraction and people come from further and further to visit us. So in the master plan, I'll show you a little bit more detail on it in the next couple of slides. Really looked at how we could do more with more, rather than needing to sort of cut back on things. Really, how could we leverage support and funding into the park to enable us to continue to provide good services for our visitors? How could we do that alongside celebrating the environment, continuing to try and improve the natural environment and improve biodiversity whilst welcoming more people into the park and engaging our communities? I think it's we know the park's used well by a variety of people, but we don't engage with all our communities in Peterborough equally, and the feedback we receive is very sort of self-selected from distinct parts of the community. So trying to plan better how we can engage more fully with the community and ensure we're actually delivering on our charitable objective of improving the quality of life of people of Peterborough, and not just a distinct section of that community. And all along with that is about developing our resources, becoming more resilient, as I mentioned, both infrastructure but also our financing. Looking at how we can grow the park. I mentioned already a couple of bits of land that have a couple of areas where we are expanding. We're constantly looking at how as a partner or as the lead, we can continue to improve the quality of green space and the quantity of green space in the city. Whether that's working with housing developers, whether that's keeping our eyes peeled for things that come on the market. The Trust is in a unique position to be able to move on a variety of opportunities such as that to provide for the benefit for our beneficiaries. And the proportion of green space per resident, without a doubt, is shrinking as more and more residents come into the city. The green space provision is not growing proportionally, and we feel it particularly in Prairie Meadows and other parts of the park even, which are becoming increasingly popular as people want that space and have less space in their homes, in their gardens. So we're conscious of that, trying to enact on that. And spreading the load is part of that as well. Prairie Meadows is very much the honeypot, and if we can help people discover different parts of the park in different ways, we can hopefully spread people out so they can find what they want from the park in the right areas. So there was a variety of maps in our master plan. Obviously, the master plan is a spatial document, and we considered a whole variety of factors in doing this plan, from the very baseline to doing a huge amount of consultation with a variety of stakeholders, and really considered how we could master plan the park, not just in a red line, but in the context of the entire city. And that included looking at where these areas of land that we might want to prioritise getting involved in with an influencer management. How can we connect up and move people through the park, and what are the key projects to help us deliver upon our charitable objects. And this moved us on, or alongside this really, but certainly moved us on to looking at our strategy that Matthew mentioned and I mentioned, the strapline of which is doing more with more, and move on to that. So building on some of the key themes of our master plan, we then developed our strategy, which this wheel tries to communicate for you. And I'm sorry if you can't read that in great detail. I'll zoom in on a couple of bits, but it's really important to think about how we do things, but also what we'll do, and that sort of divides the two sides. So we've got developing our resources, celebrating our environment, engaging our communities and growing our park, and within that a whole range of things that we aspire to work on in the next 10 years. And we're now almost 5 years into the delivery of this strategy, and we're starting to see it deliver. As Matthew says, that doesn't come without testing our capacity to do so. And so you'll see a few elements there. I'll pick out a couple to mention. I mean, certainly culture and heritage is an interesting one, having recently taken on the sculpture collection. Arts and heritage and culture are increasingly important to how we engage with people, whether that's park users who are then engaging with the arts, or whether that's people who would have an interest in arts or their own personal heritage perhaps, who may then engage with the park through that. As Matthew mentioned, we host a significant arts council project called Peterborough Presents, which is a Changing People and Places programme, CPP, which are established in several of the new towns actually, but various parts of the country described as cultural cold spots, with the idea of actually empowering communities to develop arts in their local areas. One point that's particularly of interest there is the business segment, growing financial sustainability, ensuring excellent governance, increasing capacity. Clearly that's a challenge for us all the time, and those who are local to Peterborough may well be aware that things such as parking charges are incredibly contentious for us, and people don't like, some people don't mind paying, some people possibly a minority who don't like to pay, very vocal about that, and that is a real challenge for us to try and explain how important things such as car park charges or other fundraising are to the sustainability of the Trust long term. As I said, we've got a range of investments which part of our income comes from. So we have a substantial sum, many millions in investments, and for many it's very hard for us to explain the message that because we have 30-something million pounds in investments, that doesn't mean that we can that we don't need to generate income annually to keep our revenue budgets positive. And in fact, I mentioned earlier it's a £3 million turnover, something like that. If we stop generating income, then we've got 10-15 years of money to work through, and in fact some of that endowment is protected and we can't access it, so it's not as simple as that. So having a real focus on how we grow our financial sustainability, particularly after years like the last year, is really important. And I feel the points health and well-being there, clearly really central to our strategy, as are partnerships in doing that. Yeah, I think I mentioned some of those other points in more detail. So a lot of this leads us to look, considering how we operate in terms of impact, and I'll just briefly talk about this, but the social impact is a really important element from our charitable perspective, but we've also got our environmental impact and our role as natural capital, ecosystem services, whatever other phrase you want to chuck at it, but what we provide to the city in terms of clean air, water storage, all those types of things, never mind the benefits, direct benefits on people's health and well-being. And as we move forward into the next 5 years of our strategy, this focus on impact will become really important. And so putting sort of the master plan and impact together, that then sort of moves us on to the whole variety of distinct projects that we're working on to try and deliver this more proactive approach of a green space charity rather than just an organisation that runs a park. And so on all of these individual projects, I could probably talk at great length, but I'll just mention them briefly and then stop. But one that you may be aware of or not is we've recently been successful in securing almost £2 million from the National Lottery Heritage Fund to support a £3 million project called Your Community Green Space, which is really focused at engaging with all the communities in Peterborough. And under that, we've also managed to look at how we improve some of our infrastructure to cope with this increasing demand. So things like replacing one of our key bridges, improving our visitor toilets and accessibility through a Changing Places facility, as well as our volunteer facilities, creating a nursery for people to work in. So there's a real health and wellbeing angle to that, and we've opportunities to work with the Peterborough Cambridge Foundation Trust as a mental health resource. We've got Lakeside Activity Centre, which as planners, I hope you might be aware of and may well have watched with interest, as we've been through an interesting planning process over the last couple of years to establish permission for a new activity centre in the heart of the park, which is a real testament to our ambition to be centred on health and wellbeing and a range of activities that are accessible year-round for people to use the park as a real resource for their health and wellbeing without trying to detract from the wider importance of the park and the landscape. And a whole host of other things. Nene Park Farm Shop, share farming with innovative approaches to farming to try and encourage new entrants whilst also having more autonomy over our own farmland previously all tenanted. Increasing outdoor activity and looking at a residential offer. We've got bell tents available for hire if any of you are looking for a last minute holiday we might fit you in. Looking at indoor and outdoor play, we're currently in the process of building a new outdoor play area called Fox Play with award-winning landscape architects Davis White, who previously worked on award-winning gardens with the royal family and others, although they worked with us first, to clarify that. Matthew mentioned the Future Parks Accelerator programme. We're also part of a landscape scale project called John Clare Countryside Project. Got a sculpture collection, Bringing Nature Closer, which is a project I could talk about at length. It's a really big wetland meadow restoration project, which is what's been responsible for huge increases in bird life coming to the park, and you can see an action shot there of a rotary ditcher creating these new scrapes and drains on one of our meadows. We're increasingly thinking about carbon sequestration and reduction in the park. So how can we do that both in our buildings? So how do we make the activity centre as carbon lean as possible? How do we sequester as much carbon as possible through how we manage our soils and tree planting, etc., etc. We're looking at how we improve resources in other parts of the park and facilities, whether that be play, or as an example in the bottom right there, looking at a new pop-up cafe and play in a different part of the park to help with that spreading of the load. And as I mentioned earlier, always looking at how we can expand the green space for our local communities, which is really important. Part of how we'll continue to make ourselves viable and create space for the people that need it. So a whole host of things there, which I hope I might have covered something that was interesting in between. I'm conscious of time, so I will leave it there, but very happy to take questions on any of that in generalities or great detail. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. That was really insightful. I think, what I sort of took away from that is you can really see the three objectives of sustainable development having their own pressures and their own desires from the park, and how you address those, and the way that you've just sort of gone through it there, I think is really interesting from a planning perspective. So I think before I pass over to Wei, I'll just remind those in attendance, if they've got any questions, just to pop them in the question box, and then we can go through them I've got a couple, but I'll pass over to Wei now. If you'd like to give us your thoughts, please, Wei.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Matthew and Andrew. Really inspired by your presentation. I've never been to Nene Park Trust Park before, but yeah, it's fascinating. I must go there physically next time. Can't wait. Can I ask a few questions? Because I think there are a lot of very useful experiments we can learn and can be applied not only in the UK but also worldwide. I think first question is because it's a parks trust. So have you been using the land value capture model in your income? And if you could tell me more about that a little bit. And also, I'm very interested to see your master plan is from 2017 to 2050. It's very long-term thinking. And because the Peterborough's zero carbon strategy, the city want to achieve zero carbon by 2030. So what is your consideration between the park's master plan to the zero carbon target in Peterborough, and why you use 2050, this 33 years timescale for the consideration? Is there a particular reason for that?
So Matthew, do you want to cover the first bit about land value capture, and I'll cover the second question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the model that we have doesn't really take account of land value capture in the way that I think you're asking the question, Wei. And I think, although I think that our plans for the future may well include more capture of the land value itself, I mean, it's probably worth saying that we don't even value our land when it comes to our balance sheet. So, and we look at it in a slightly different way. And I think as we move the model from being one that's reliant on earned income, tenant rent roll essentially, and return on the stock market through to much more innovative forms of income, probably many associated with the climate emergency, so carbon capture, as we consider our opportunities with biodiversity net gain, and with valuing or valuing and capturing the income from natural capital in its various different ways. We'll start to look at things a little differently, but I think we're very fortunate with our model. It would be the final thing to say on this point, in that we've not really needed to look at land values necessarily, and neither have we had to develop any of our land and sell it off to fund any of our operations. But what we have been doing is gradually developing in a very so we have the criteria for much of our development so far, and we're slightly different to Milton Keynes in this respect, is that where we've invested in developing, we've invested in developing in Peterborough, and in most cases very close to the park. And when we have invested, we've tried to invest in activity, buildings, commercial opportunities that deliver two things: a return on investment at a commercial level, but also increasing our charitable impact. So those two things are kind of the principles by which we tend to invest in and out of that have come things like a cycling superstore, which we have a tenant, Rutland Cycling, who run that on our behalf. And the same principle, although we'll run it ourselves, is being applied to the activity centre, which Andrew referred to, which is essentially an Olympic standard climbing centre with children's play and a fairly large restaurant as part of that. So you can kind of see the theme that we work to. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
And I suppose in relation to the master plan, a couple of questions on there. Well, one was around sort of the carbon neutrality point, but also the length of the master plan. I mean, I think one of the great benefits of the trust is our ability to think long term, and our independence from political cycles or funding cycles of local government. And I mean, Matthew might have a slightly different view, but I think the length of time to 2050 seemed like a period long enough for the ambition of those larger scale projects and that future development of the park to take place. It also sort of matches up with the age that we were in the park. You know, we've had 30 years, you know, what's the coming 30 years going to hold? because one of the issues for us, and we're reviewing the master plan at the moment, sort of 5 years in, is to try and make it accessible and real to our users and our staff team and others involved, as well as aspirational long term. So many of our projects within the master plan, some of them probably slipped in that were a little bit too immediate and probably not master plan enough in scale, but they made the connection with what was happening on the ground into the master plan. And some of the projects that were in our master plan are certainly much longer term. But equally within that, we hold a lot of flexibility that some of them may happen, when an opportunity arises, we may well seize that, or it may be another 10 years before something happens. So for instance, expanding the park as an example, it's an interesting one. There are a few areas of development on the peripheries of the park that might or might not happen within the length of the master plan. And that when we were creating the master plan, there was one that was in particular sort of contention at that time on whether it would be included within the local plan, and it subsequently wasn't. That area is still owned by Homes England. There's other areas which are of interest to developers, and all those areas would potentially expand the park, but at the very least have a significant impact on the park in terms of then new users joining different parts. So the length of time sort of felt appropriate to the view we were able to take. And with regards to carbon, I think that was something which, although it was on our agenda when the master plan was created, it wasn't as high on our agenda as hindsight would like us to have put it, I think. And I think certainly the last few years has seen the importance of climate emergency really sort of rising up in the importance of the work we do. And I think maybe because it feels like something that's core to us, possibly is a reason why we didn't focus too heavily on it as part of our master plan. We have an aspiration as a trust to be carbon neutral. 2035 is what we're aiming for. I think depending on how you count our figures, you could say we're carbon neutral already, but I think we need to be very honest and very clear that there's two sets of calculations that need to go on. One is about how we operate as an organisation, and one is about what we provide as a landowner, as a natural capital, and the sort of ongoing sequestration and resources that the trust provides. So we're very focused on reducing our organisational impact, and but also using that as an opportunity to educate, inform, support our visitors as well, with a significant number of visitors coming into the park. And I think, as Matthew mentioned earlier, we're increasingly linking with external partners. So the City Council, whilst we're still independent from them, we're increasingly a partner on a range of fronts with them. So I think as the city looks to become the environmental capital that it wants to be, the trust will inevitably take a significant role in that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm really encouraged by your long-term vision. Thank you.
Good stuff. Just on that point, Andrea, I was just wondering, what kind of engagement did you have with the local plan process? I understand Peter had a local plan adopted just a couple of years ago. So did the park take quite a key role in the development of that local plan? So its core strategy, or the strategy that you mentioned earlier, was aligned with the local plan.
Yeah, so we probably didn't have as big a role then as we would have today. I think we've changed in the standing that the council hold of us, probably, and our sort of engagement and awareness more so. But nonetheless, the master plan was referenced within the local plan, and has given us a pretty good standing on a couple of planning matters in terms of how the master plan has been considered within that, almost as a planning document. We did respond directly to the local plan as a substantial sort of local land stakeholder, and did feed into that process. But I think it probably wasn't, there wasn't probably a strategic green space view taken across the city with that local plan particularly. Although Matthew might have a slightly different view or some thoughts on that. But yeah, it feels like if we were to do it again, we may well have more input.
I think we probably influenced planning in the city in a slightly different way, in that we were very involved in the development of a green infrastructure strategy for the city, which has played into the local plan, and even more involved in making sure that green infrastructure strategy became supplementary planning document for the city as well. So I think we probably have played our part. I think it's that more spatial set of challenges that I think what actually happened was we ran ahead, we put our master plan together, and our master plan was taken into account when the local plan was developed. So I think that's the way it's probably worked.
Right, great, thank you for that. Yeah, another question that we've had is, how are you improving inclusivity at the park? So I understand from the slide that you touched on earlier, Andrew, regarding Peterborough's diverse population. So I think that's sort of one element to it, but also looking at how the park can be inclusive of those with disabilities and complex needs, etc., etc. So just wondered if you could touch on those elements, please.
Yeah, so and in terms of accessibility, I suppose, and that area around sort of variety of needs that our visitors might have, it's an area which is really important to us, and I think so there's a member of my team who sort of has a specialism around access particularly, and it's something which we work very hard on. I think one of the key things we try to work on is making sure we've got some of the basics right in terms of how people can access the park, but we've also built upon that with extra provisions. So for instance, we have free mobility scooters that can be hired from our visitor centre, or not hired, borrowed from our visitor centre for nothing. And they can be easily booked, and we have some adapted wheelchairs again which are available, called mountain trikes, for people to use, and we've been improving our facilities over the years, although we still have some that are substandard. So for instance, our cafe toilets in our Prairie Meadows Cafe, which is one of the original buildings that came over to the trust, the toilets there are substandard, and they've been closed since COVID started because there isn't enough space there. But that's an area where we'll be spending a significant sum of money this year to improve those toilets, and one of the key elements of that has been to ensure that we have an appropriate accessible toilet in there that is of the right standards now, but also have a range of toilet cubicles, separate rooms and space that people can use for a whole variety of needs. And I think the basics of running a park, and I've talked about all the other things we can do, but the real basics are a loo, a view and a brew, which we always come back to. And actually getting some of those facilities right, really important. So another thing is one of the key elements of the community green space project is looking at our welcome area, our sort of main point of arrival in Prairie Meadows, and improving that. So one, it actually has a sense of welcome. It's pretty underwhelming at the moment. It's certainly a landscape of its time. So we've got a lot of sort of landscape work to do there, but also look again at improving the toilets and extending them to include a changing places facility. So we have one facility in the park that's just below changing places facility standards, but it has a hoist and a lift and a shower, but we're looking at making a more publicly accessible one. So it's something which we're really conscious of, but then there's other areas where we know we have an impact, such as car parking charges, and that has an impact on people with lower incomes and their ability to come to the park, and we don't have very good public transport to the park currently. So there are areas like that we're really keen to try and focus on, and there are answers to some of that, such as better access to the park through sustainable transport. So for instance, we're currently working on a partnership with the Voi bikes company. So there's electric bikes that is somewhat similar to the Boris bike sort of thing, and the Voi scooters that are in some other cities. And obviously we work with Rutland Cycling, so trying to find ways people can come to the park without needing to bring a car, but obviously for people who have a disability or rely on a car, that's an issue as well. So it's something we continue to consider. Diversity of communities, as I say, one thing that is something that we're very aware of. The communities we serve are diverse, and I think we do have a diverse range of visitors that come to the park generally, but there are many who still don't even know the park exists, who sort of live in Peterborough and who wouldn't think it's necessarily for them, or wouldn't know what they're allowed to do, what they're allowed to visit. And there's a really interesting talk which I think is probably found on YouTube, from Dr. Bridget Snaith, about green space and inequalities in access to green space and how people perceive it. And I think there's a move towards naturalising the park landscape for us, which feels like a really important thing to do and really nice. But actually, for many visitors, that can make the environment feel less safe and not welcoming and not what they expect of a park. And a lot of that's cultural. And I think being aware of that as park managers and aware of that in what we do can make the park more accessible to people. So it's something which yeah, is high on our agenda and something which we're really focusing on. And that lottery project, as I mentioned, is basically the focus of that is around inclusivity.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that, Andrew, Matthew, Wei. I think we are just about run out of time now. I think that probably ties things up quite well. I appreciate there may have been some questions that we've missed out today. So for those that have got any questions that have hung over from the session, I'm sure Andrew, Matthew, if you're contactable somehow, I'm sure that they'd be happy to answer those questions for you. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you both for coming on today, and it's a pleasure to have you on as well, Wei. So yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for those who have attended today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.